So here we are starting day 2. We spend most of today working with the dough. Firstly, we're going to lightly flour our work surface and then take the dough out of the fridge, dump it onto the surface. We covered it in parchment paper yesterday. It takes a bit of maneuvering to get the parchment paper off. Just take your time, go slow. Full disclosure, this was my second time making a dough that uses this technique, and I don't think I have it quite right yet. So I'll be including a link to a tutorial about this laminating process also, but that'll be in a separate video. So once we have the parchment paper off, we are going to roll out the dough. We are preparing it to hold the butter, and we want this to be the same height as our butter but twice as wide, because we're going to put the butter on one side and fold the other dough over it like an envelope. So we want it to be a rectangle that is about 12 inches by 16 inches. Once it's big enough, we put that butter on it, and then we lift up that other dough to fold it around it. This is called locking in the butter. And I'm kind of pinching the edges so that it'll stay. The next thing we're going to do is a 4-fold or a book fold. You might have heard about it on Great British Bake Show. So we are roughly dividing the dough into fourths. We fold the outer fourths in towards the center, and then we fold those 2 halves in again. That was Mr. Ruskin. He really wanted to be in these videos. So once we've done this, we are going to pop it in the fridge and get it to cool down. The important thing throughout this whole process is that time in the fridge, because we want to keep the butter cold. That's what will give it that puff in the oven. So I'm just taking some press and seal, getting the dough into it. The press and seal kind of makes a nice container for it. So after our dough has chilled in the fridge for 30 minutes, we're going to bring it out again and do a 3-fold. First, we're going to lightly flour the surface of our table so that the dough doesn't stick too much. So to do a 3-fold, we roll out the dough again. We want to try and keep it rectangular as much as possible. And then we kind of, I'm getting ahead of myself, I'm still rolling. And once we're ready to fold it, we divide the dough kind of in thirds and fold 1/3 in towards the center, and then the last third towards the center. Then we will pop it back in the fridge again for another half hour. We will repeat that twice. I only filmed it once, but that was an accident, so you're doing that twice. So pretend that we did that 3-fold a second time. I accidentally forgot to film that. And then after that second time, you're going to wrap up your dough in plastic wrap, just like we did before, and put it in the freezer. Putting it in the freezer for 2 hours. We want to keep that butter nice and cold before we shape it. So now we are pulling the dough out of the freezer, putting it on a lightly floured surface again, and we're going to roll it out into a rectangle. This will be harder to work this time because the dough is much colder. If the dough sticks to your rolling pin, you can put some flour on top. You kind of see the butter through the dough. That was my first sign that I had screwed something up. Hopefully yours doesn't look like that. And then once we have it in a rectangle, about 18 by 20 inches and about a 1/4 inch thick, then we're going to let the dough hang out in the refrigerator this time, not the freezer, for 30 minutes until it's firm to the touch. This is where it all starts to come together. So after our dough has chilled in the fridge for half an hour and is firm to the touch, we take it out of the fridge. And here you see me squaring the edges. And we're going to put the pastry cream on top. I used an offset spatula for this. You can use anything you want, but I found this worked really nicely for the container that I was getting out of and also for spreading it. You want to spread it in a thin, even layer. I think one of the things I screwed up is that my dough here is a little too thick, so hopefully yours is a little bit thinner than this is. And once you've spread the pastry cream, you will put the poached raisins on top and kind of sprinkle it around, spreading it evenly. Once your raisins are on, you're going to roll up the dough and make it look kind of like a log. You do not want the parchment paper or the press and seal on the bottom as you do this because you're going to slice it once it's rolled and then bake it, and we don't want to bake plastic. That would be a bad idea. We don't want to eat plastic either. So once it's all rolled up, you're going to slice it. I started using a pastry knife or a dough cutter, and then that wasn't working so well, so I switched to a regular chef's knife after a little bit. That worked much better. When it started to stick, I just wipe it off with hot water. And you'll see I used a ruler to mark. We want these to be about 1 inch thick. I'm just using that extra odd bits of dough, just rolling them up, bake them. It'll be yummy, whatever. The last thing we need to do before we pop these in the oven is make the egg wash, which is just equal parts egg and milk. If you recall the other day for the pastry cream, I had used like half of an egg. I saved the other half for this egg wash. So weighing the egg, adding the same amount of milk, whisk them together, and then you use a brush to just brush it on the surface. I probably was a little heavy-handed when I put it on. You could go a little bit lighter than that. So as I was putting this video together for you guys, I realized that I skipped a step. That's at least one of the places where I screwed this up. So after you put the egg wash, you should let them proof at ideally at 82 degrees Fahrenheit, but if you don't have a proofing oven or a proofing drawer like me, I mean, I don't have one of those. I would love to, but I don't yet. Room temperature is going to have to work. So I should have let them proof for 2 hours. Should have done that. So ideally, after you proofed them, because you fully read the directions, even though I didn't the first time, you will put them in the oven at 365 degrees Fahrenheit until golden brown. The recipe says it should take 7 to 8 minutes. For me, it took 25, probably because I skipped the proofing step. Ah. The last part we need to actually make is that apricot glaze. And it's not difficult, it's just the timing that's a little bit tricky because you have to bring the apricot glaze to a boil as you're cooking it and then let it cool down to about 75 degrees, but then you still have to use it while it's warm. At the same time, You want to put it on your pain raisin while they are still warm. So ideally, you're making this while they are in the oven. Ideally, you've gotten them all in the oven at the same time, and you can do it all in one go. If you don't live in a perfect world, like the rest of us, you'll want to keep it warm on the stove while you're in between your first batch and your second and maybe third batches, just trying to keep it like just barely warm. If it gets cold or too cool, then it sticks to your pan and is really difficult to use and even harder to clean up. Step 1 is letting the water and gelatin bloom, just kind of stirring them together. I don't mean Jello by gelatin, I mean like actual gelatin. Knox is the brand that you'll see most often. It's in a white box. It is super cheap. We're not doing anything with that cast iron skillet hanging out in the background. That's just kind of where it lives. We are working with that front saucepan. So we are combining the corn syrup, lemon juice, and apricot jam in that saucepan and making that boil. Once it boils, we put in the melted gelatin. Then we're letting it cool and using it immediately. So I used some cooling racks to put the pastries on as they came out, and I put parchment paper underneath because that glaze will kind of drip a little bit. And so here you see me putting them on as they come out of the oven and putting that glaze on. Okay, so this is the little baby. That was the little butt that I cut off at the end, and this is gonna be the first one that I try. I just put the apricot glaze on it. As I already commented, these ended up like twice as big as they were supposed to be. I probably screwed up the lamination process and then also didn't roll them out thin enough. But hopefully they still taste okay. It is fully cooked, which I was a little worried about. But like, the ratios are off. There's too much bread, not enough pastry cream. And again, that's just caused by the dough being thicker than it's supposed to be. So try again next time.